Hi, my name's Katie Subra. I am currently residing in Winona, Minnesota, and I'm doing this video for my friend Maya and her students back in Braslav, Belarus. I'm going to talk briefly about three topics, so the education, sites, and language comparisons between Belarus and the US. I have to admit I don't know as much about Belarus. Obviously, I'm American, and I spent 9 months in Belarus back in 2013 and 14, so I am familiar with many of these things, but to move on, from what I know, one of the main differences about education between these two countries is that in Belarus, I think the education system is much more standardized. You have the Ministry of Education that oversees the schools, and most people know what their trajectory is going to be for university studies and future careers much sooner than in the US. Whereas in the US we have pretty much public versus private institutions, and private institutions are almost always good, although they have to be funded privately by the families, and public institutions could be good or bad depending on what school district you're in. So there's good and bad school districts based on the leadership there and the funding that comes from taxes. So generally speaking, if it's a poorer neighborhood, and often in big cities there's neighborhoods that are like that, then the school might not be as well funded. But then we have a lot of smaller public schools, large public schools, and if the funding there is good, then the school will be good. We also have special education, gifted education, and a lot of college prep in our high school education or secondary education, which means that if students have really specific needs, or if they're very talented and want to get ahead and get started on their college education with some early credits while they're in high school, they can do that. Even though it's not typical for our students to choose a major or career path while they're in high school. In terms of sites, we have some things that are similar. So in the US, just as in Belarus, we have beautiful forests and grasslands. We don't have a forest with Father Frost in it, however, but in my state, in Minnesota, we have a lot of beautiful forests and lakes as well. It seems very similar to Belarus. However, in the US, we also have mountain ranges and desert and a lot of state parks, so you can really see every type of flora and fauna if you go to different regions within the US. Although it's much harder to get around here, you are more likely to be driving your own vehicle versus taking public transportation, trains, cars, buses, and things like that, which are more available in Belarus. In terms of language, I would say it is quite diverse here. If you look at just population-wise, there's people who speak hundreds of different languages within the US, and I'm speaking about native indigenous languages as well as a very high percentage of people who speak Spanish, which many people would argue is indigenous here as well, not just English. But we also have American Indian languages, many depending on which region of the US you go in. In Minnesota, a lot of Native Americans speak Ojibwe, although these are languages that are shrinking, unfortunately. But then because of immigration, you can hear people speaking everything from Russian to Chinese to Korean and everything in between. So language is diverse because of the diverse population. However, I will say that individual language is not as diverse as in Belarus. So while we do try to learn a second language in high school and in college, we don't become fluent in it. And I noted that in Belarus many people spoke at least 2 or 3 languages, if not more, and they were quite humble about that language ability, assuming that they really only spoke 1 or 2 languages because that's what they felt most proficient in. But the fact was that, from my perspective, they were quite fluent in 3 or even more languages. I've learned little bits and pieces of multiple languages, but never became proficient in any of them. So that's one of the bigger differences. I think a similarity is that even within Belarus, despite it being smaller than the US, you have different dialects, depending on if you're in a rural or urban area. In the US, we have many dialects that are across the country. So, you have northeastern dialects, southeastern dialects, south central, Central America, West Coast, you name it. So the dialects here might be a little bit more diverse just in terms of geography. But it's been a pleasure to talk to you, and please let me know through your teacher if you have any other questions about these 3 topics. Bye.